It was bedtime, and the 8-year-old boy was dreading his nightly routine. While his sisters went upstairs to bed, he would start his descent into the cold, dark basement. He would lie in bed, listening to the rats scurry through the walls, and he would fantasize. He would fantasize about killing his mother. Welcome to SKB, Dissecting the Serial Killer's Brain. I'm your host, Caroline, a university biology professor and true crime junkie. Thanks for joining me on my quest to understand evil. The Coed Killer claimed 10 victims between 1964 and 1973, terrorizing the Santa Cruz area from 1972 to 1973, murdering 6 young women before killing his mother and her best friend and then turning himself in. What was it that created this monster? Was it nature? Was it nurture? Or was it some combination of these? Edmund Emil Kemper III, Guy to his family, was born in Burbank, California on December 18, 1948. Ed was the middle child and only son of Clarnell Strandberg and Edmund Emil Kemper Jr., who was known as E.E. And he was born in Burbank, California. Ed was the second child of E.E. and Clarnell. His older sister Susan was 6 at the time of his birth. And then when Ed was around age 2.5, his younger sister Ellen was born. Ed was big from the beginning. He weighed in at a whopping 13 pounds at birth, which I can't even imagine. The average birth weight today is like 7.5 pounds. By age 4, Ed was a foot taller than his classmates. By 15, he was 6'4", and when he reached adulthood, Ed was 6'9" and close to 300 pounds. His imposing size earned him the nickname Big Ed by his cop friends as an adult. Ed's father, Edmund Emil Kemper Jr., or E.E., was born in 1919. E.E. was a World War II vet, and he'd been with a Special Forces unit, which included suicide missions. E.E. was about 6'8", and Ed's mother, Clarnell, who was about 6 foot tall, they were large and loud. In good times, there was lots of joking, but in bad times, it was a different story. E.E. was very passive, and this is a trait that Clarnell found infuriating. Clarnell was domineering and abusive. Ed's parents had a very toxic and tumultuous marriage. Clarnell would regularly ridicule and belittle E.E. in front of the children, effectively emasculating him with her cruelty. There was a great deal of physical and verbal abuse in the Kemper house. Clarnell was beyond difficult. In fact, E.E. later stated about Clarnell that she, quote, affected me as a grown man more than 396 days and nights of fighting on the front did, end quote. To Clarnell, E.E. never left the war. He was not successful in college because he could not get along with his instructors, and he had a hard time getting back into studying. E.E. became an electrician, but Clarnell found this to be too menial. The effect of this constant turmoil between his parents had lasting consequences, the least of which was a distorted view of male-female relationships. Children exposed to violence between parents, coupled with a lack of sex education, sex was taboo in the Kemper house. This can obscure the line between sex and violence. Kemper may have inadvertently seen his parents engaged in sex, and this blurring of violence and sex in children can be really devastating. In fact, Dr. David Abrahamson, who was a leading authority on violence in America, postulated that children interpret sex between parents as a violent act in which his father is hurting his mother. Quote, to the child's mind, sex, the primal scene, is a bloody crime which, because it's a secret, he is forbidden to watch, end quote. So when a child sees his parents having sex, the child often interprets this as violence, especially when there is no sex education in the home. Margaret Cheney, in her book, The Coed Killer, a study of murders, mutilations, and matricide of Edmund Kemper III, speculates that Ed may have been exposed to some sort of heterosexual overstimulation, and this kind of sexual overstimulation is a common theme that we see in sexually motivated serial killers. Psychologists would later remark that Ed had an insatiable interest in sex. When Ed was just 4 years old, his father, E.E., went away for 2 years to work at an atomic testing facility in the Pacific, leaving Clarnell alone with Susan, age 10, Ed, age 4, and Alan, age 1.5. Ed worshipped his father, and he feared his mother. During E.E.'s absence, which was roughly between 1952 and 1954, Clarnell's drinking increased, and so did her verbal abuse of young Ed. It was during this time that Ed reports having had a couple of near-death experiences as well, and both of these were at the hands of his older sister, Susan. In one incident, Susan supposedly pushed Ed onto train tracks when a train was coming. In another incident, Susan threw Ed into the deep end of a swimming pool even though she knew he could not swim. These stories, like many of Ed's stories that he tells, exist in several different versions, so it's hard to know exactly what the truth was. E.E. returned home in 1954 when Ed was 6, but within a couple of years of his return, E.E. and Clarnell separated. E.E. later alleged that Clarnell had developed, a pretty severe drinking problem. So Ed's mother was an alcoholic, and maybe she drank while she was pregnant. In the 1940s, I don't think people really understood the link between, alcoholism, smoking, taking drugs, etc., and fetal health. And in women who drink during pregnancy, even a low-level exposure to alcohol to a fetus has been shown to cause a deficit in the development of the white matter in areas of executive functioning of the brain, so places like the prefrontal cortex. By 1957, Clarnell took her 3 children and moved them all to her hometown of Helena, Montana. Ed, who was very close to his father, was devastated by the move. And worse, now he was the lone male living with a real man-hater, as Ed would describe her later, and his 2 sisters. Ed reported that Susan, she mimicked her mother's verbal abuse of him. With E.E. out of the picture, Ed became the sole recipient of Clarnell's verbal abuse. He contributes this abuse to the fact that he reminded her of E.E., and Clarnell would regularly tell her son that he was a real weirdo and make fun of him for his size. E.E. and Clarnell eventually divorced in 1961, and E.E. remarried a German immigrant with a son who was a couple of years older than Ed, a few months after this divorce. Clarnell went on to marry 3 more times, but she managed to run off each new husband. So, Ed's childhood exposure to violent relationships definitely came blurred with his idea of sex. Ed was a fearful and timid child, and this seemed to infuriate Clarnell. She felt it was her responsibility to make him a man. When Ed was just 8 or 9 years old, his mother made him sell papers on the street, and she wouldn't let him return until he sold them all. About this time, Clarnell moved Ed into a room in the basement. This was not a nice finished basement, but it was a cold, poorly lit basement where Ed could hear the rats scurrying through the walls as he tried to sleep.
It was a full basement, had granite walls, hewn wood floorboards, and it looked like some old dungeon out of a castle or something. I was 8 years old, 7.5, 8 years old, and then I was very susceptible. My imagination was very livid. And there was an old furnace in the basement that had been converted from burning coal to burning and coal and wood to burning gas. And it had a central heating system with your typical radiators. And if you've ever lived in a home like that, you know the binging, the clang, the pop, the rattles, the weird sounds in the night that can be spooky to a kid. Well, at a certain time of the evening, the family left the center room, the living room of the house. My mother and my sisters, or my sisters themselves, would go up to bed upstairs, where I used to go to bed upstairs. I had to go down to the basement. And an 8-year-old child had a tough time differentiating the reason in that. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell, they're going to heaven.
It was during this time that Ed began to have morbid sexual fantasies that grew out of his anger towards his mother. And also, it came out of his interest in being the only person left on Earth.
What I was fantasizing about, I was building up big loads of frustration inside, big loads of hatred, because I had no outlet for it. I should have developed outlets, but I didn't know how at that time. So the outlets that developed themselves, or I developed without knowing it, were fantasies about me being the last. I got that out of a school book, this thing of being the last person alive on the world. And the thing that was posed to me in this textbook was social studies, and it was meant to play upon the loneliness youngsters can feel, and that it's a very uncomfortable feeling, and you can't have love, and you can't have adventure, and you can't have excitement without being able to share it with other people, because that's where a lot of the dimension comes from. Okay, so they posed this thing, well, what if you were the last person in the world, and you had all these cars and airplanes and boats and ships and things to do, but nobody to share it with, right? Wouldn't that be awful? And I thought, hey, that's a thought. I never thought of that before. So it became a seed, like a little core to fantasies for me. Some mysterious thing has happened and everybody else is gone, and I got all these things I can do and no inhibitions, no restrictions. I can do what I want. I don't get yelled at anymore. Okay, that soon became very hollow. So I built upon that and added to it. Well, people were still around, but they were inanimate. They couldn't affect me. They couldn't hurt me.
These morbid fantasies, Ed would act them out in real life. For example, he would remove the hands and decapitate his sister's dolls.
I had a cap gun. It was by Mattel, right? Fanner 50. It was a very fancy cap gun. I got it in New York City. I went there for one summer with a cousin. And when I came back, my sister was kind of jealous, my little sister. For years, I never really put any value on what happened. Tried to, figure out beyond the obvious what happened in this scenario. But I've since found it plausible to believe that when she was angry or jealous about something, she would fuel her attitude toward resolving something. She hated that cap gun because it came between us as brother and sister. It was something I had that she didn't have. That trip represented something she really wanted, she didn't get, and I did. But very soon after getting back from that trip, she got in an argument with me. It was over something really petty. She got really outraged. She picked up that cap pistol. I said, "Don't throw that." And she threw it right at me. Wham! Hard. It hit the floor and my toe, and it hurt bad. But it broke the gun, the inner mechanism. It wouldn't work after that. I picked it up. I found that out. It wouldn't cock and pull the trigger anymore. And that really outraged me. So I said, "So you want to play like that, huh?" So I go running into her room. She says, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" She's shrieking and chasing me, right? So I run into her room, and I grab up her Barbie doll. It was the one fancy doll she had, the Barbie doll. Everybody has one, right? She had a pair of sewing scissors sitting there and a sewing machine, a sewing kit. I grabbed the scissors out. The head didn't decapitate. It pops off. So I popped that off. I said, "Well, that's going to go right back on. That's no damage." So I took the scissors and I cut the hands off the doll. I said, "Here, now you got a toy that doesn't work too good. I got a toy that doesn't work too good."
So we can see by age 8, Ed was having fantasies about killing his mother, the woman who had locked him away in the scary basement. Clarnell's reason for isolating Ed was that she was worried he would hurt or rape his sisters because of his already intimidating size. So what impact or role did Ed's isolation have on his developing brain? Well, consistent fear and anxiety in a child so young can have very long-lasting effects on the development of the brain. Anxiety disorders tend to manifest during late childhood and early adolescence, and they're correlated to dysfunction in a couple areas of the brain. One, the amygdala, and the other is the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala in children with anxiety disorders is much more active. The amygdala is basically your fear center. It controls your autonomic responses that are associated with fear, arousal, and emotional stimulation, and it's been linked to neuropsychiatric disorders such as anxiety disorders and social phobias. So children with anxiety disorders, they have a very overactive amygdala. And the amygdala is involved in decoding emotions, particularly threatening stimuli. And interestingly, psychopaths exhibit a lower activation threshold for the amygdala. So what that means is that the amygdala doesn't get it does, that fear part doesn't get activated as quickly as it would in somebody who is a non-psychopath. During something called contextual fear conditioning, a person learns to associate an aversive event with a particular context rather than a distinct cue. So repetition of contextual fear conditioning reinforces the fear in the same way that, like, flowing water will deepen the groove in a stream or a river. And the difference between what happens with a child's brain and an adult brain when there is PTSD or anxiety, this lies in the development of the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is important in inhibiting impulses, and it allows us to exhibit proper social behavior. A particular area of the prefrontal cortex called the medial prefrontal cortex is where the fear response is extinguished. So violent offenders and murderers show reduced glucose metabolism in the prefrontal cortex. And what that means is that the prefrontal cortex in a violent offender is less developed and less active. In antisocial individuals, there's reduced gray matter in the frontal lobe. So let me stop right here for a second and explain briefly what gray matter and white matter are in the brain. So the basic functional unit of the nervous system is called a neuron. And neurons are located within the brain, the spinal cord, all of your peripheral nerves, those sorts of things. So in any kind of nervous tissue that is referred to as white matter, what that means is it's myelinated. So what's myelinated? Well, there is it's almost like a fatty substance that coats the information or the electrical signal transferring part of the neuron. So you've got different parts of a neuron. There's like the body of the neuron where all of this stuff originates. And then there's the axon. And the axon is what takes the electrical signal from the body of the neuron to wherever its target is. So if you think of it kind of like the plastic coating around an electrical cord. So the plastic coating around an electrical cord, what that does, and I'm no electrician, but this is my general understanding of it, is that that plastic coating around those wires that are transferring electricity from the wall to whatever, your computer or whatever it is that you are bringing electricity to, that plastic coating keeps the electrical signal inside, so it prevents a lot of loss of electricity. So myelin, this fatty-like substance that surrounds the axons, it functions in a similar way. So it speeds up the transmission of electrical signals, because that's how the nervous system works, is through electricity. It speeds up those electrical, and that's of course a very simplistic way of saying it, but it speeds up the conduction, so as fast as that electricity can move, and it also prevents it from dissipating on its way out by escaping out of the axon. So white matter is important because that's where kind of faster signals happen. Gray matter is where you get these big conglomerations of neuron cell bodies, and so that's where a lot of the signaling and things start. All right, so back to Ed. Ed's behaviors did not help him dispel his mother's view of him being a real weirdo. He and his younger sister played games like one called Gas Chamber, in which Ed was tied to a chair and he would pretend to be executed. Ed also developed a morbid interest in decapitation, right? So some of these interviews, he talks about the doll dismemberment, and other ones he talks about a couple of other childhood, or two other childhood events that could have placed the seeds of his interest in decapitation. In his 1984 interview, Ed describes an incident in which his father decapitated Ed's pet chicken, and then his mother made him eat it for dinner.
I could put it on an incident. I mean, my father chopping the heads off of our two pet chickens and my mother insisting that I eat them for dinner.
In a 1991 interview, Ed recalls seeing a magic act when he was in his early teens in which a pretty 16-year-old girl was going to be decapitated by a guillotine.
I'm not standing in this crowd watching this show. And he wanted to volunteer out of the audience. And some quite beautiful little 16-year-old girl gets up there and this big laugh and, all giddy and stuff. And I start getting caught up in this. I said, wow. Right at that moment, I departed reality because logically I should have been able to ascertain that that could not happen. You're not going to get away with chopping somebody's head off in the middle of Helena, Montana, the capital city. But the concept of it was so raw and it was titillating. I says, wow, Jay, I gotta watch this. And he had her girlfriend come over and put her hands there to catch her head so it wouldn't fall in the basket, And he was making jokes about this. I got caught up in this interplay between normal concerns. You don't want to get a bump on her head. Well, hey, if you're chopping her head off, it doesn't matter, right? And this is catching in my mind somehow, and I'm saying, wow. And naturally, everybody let out a shriek, and they're all excited and, oh, wow. And as he chops and the potato falls and her head doesn't go anyplace, and he unlocks the brace, and she gets out laughing, and he gives her some little prize for coming up and participating in the experiment. That's the first time I'd ever seen a show like that. You see things like that on TV, it's one thing, but to be there and watch things like that, you get more caught up in it. And I went from there. That became another piece. That's the only way I could really... The only event in my life that I can align that fascination with was the fact that she was a very alluring young lady.
Ed is showing some very disturbing personality traits or interests very early on. He even started engaging in animal cruelty when he was just 10 years old. The story goes that he buried the family cat alive, and then later he dug it up, decapitated it, and placed the cat's head on a stick. Ed said that he felt that by killing the cat, it made the cat his forever. A lot of criminalists and psychologists will talk about how cats in particular are the main choice of future serial killers because they represent the feminine or whatever. Well, in addition to his animal cruelty, Ed had a couple of confusing early sexual encounters. When he was 8, his 14-year-old sister lured him into bed, and once he got into bed with her, he was frightened by the sexual response he felt. And it was about this time, too, that Ed met one of Susan's teachers, his older sister's teachers, and he confided in his sister that he would like to kiss the teacher. Susan told him to go ahead and do it, but Ed said he would have to kill the teacher first if he was going to kiss her. So remember that sex was not discussed in the Kemper household. It was taboo, so Ed did not understand what he was feeling or why he was feeling it. A couple of years later, again when he was about 10, Ed had another confusing sexual experience, but this time it was with an older male cousin. And there's not a lot of details about that out there. Throughout Ed's formative years, Clarnell continued to verbally assault her only son, as well as each of her husbands. It's very difficult for me to even try to understand how Clarnell could treat young Ed so poorly. I mean, instinctually, don't all parents want their children to be more successful, happier, better adjusted than they were? My sweet little boy is 19 years old, and I know I would do anything to protect him from pain. Although he could do a much better job of protecting me than I could of protecting him. But I guess there is an explanation for why... There is an explanation for Clarnell's abhorrent treatment of her only son. I've read several articles alleging that Clarnell likely had borderline personality disorder. So here's Ed, living in an all-female household with an overbearing, verbally abusive, man-hating mother who is likely an alcoholic with borderline personality disorder. I mean, that's a recipe for an incredibly messed up child. And borderline personality disorder is a mental disorder characterized by mood instability, compulsive and or impulsive behavior, irritability, antisocial behavior, narcissism, and grandiose ideations. So in layman's terms, Clarnell was a crazy bitch. In her book, Understanding the Borderline Mother, Christine Lawson describes Clarnell Kemper as a witch mother. And this is a specific manifestation of the borderline mother. Lawson states, quote, "All mothers lose their temper, but ordinary mothers do not turn on their children, set traps, ridicule, humiliate, or enjoy watching them suffer. Ordinary mothers would sacrifice their lives to save their children. In contrast, the borderline witch sacrifices her child to save herself." End quote. Diane Downs, She was a woman who killed her daughter, and then she attempted to murder her other two small children. And then Susan Smith, who drove her car into a lake with her two young sons strapped into the car seats in the back, are just a couple of examples of these borderline witch mothers. These are women who put their own needs and happiness above their children. So let's review some of the key events and the key characteristics of Ed's childhood. Ed was isolated physically to the basement at age 8 and emotionally since birth. His mother likely had borderline personality disorder. Now, the issue with borderline personality disorder is not just in having a mean mommy, but in a mother who has a borderline personality disorder, it affects their bonding with the child. And so there's a hormone called oxytocin. And I'm sure you've heard of oxytocin, but let me kind of give you the different jobs or roles of oxytocin. So oxytocin it's the hormone that causes your uterus to contract during labor. So, you release a little oxytocin, you get some contractions of the uterus, and then more oxytocin, more contraction, stronger contraction, right? So, not only does oxytocin do that, but oxytocin is released during breastfeeding, and it's released by mother and by child. And what that does is it helps to form the mother-child bond. A dear friend of mine had a baby, 8-9 months ago now, and she's a biologist. She knows all of this stuff, but I can't help myself, and so I start lecturing her on when she's breastfeeding her son to put her phone down so she makes eye contact with the baby and all this kind of stuff. And she said that they actually covered that in like the childbirthing classes. But so when you don't make eye contact with your baby, when there's not that skin-on-skin contact, that can have an impact on the oxytocin that's being released, and then it can halt any kind of bond that is being formed between mother or primary caregiver and baby. Now, when there is a disruption in this oxytocin relationship early on in the child's life, it can cause or lead to attachment disorders. So there are a few different kinds, but the big one is reactive attachment disorder. In reactive attachment disorder, it results from negative interactions with caregivers early on. There was the little girl's name? She's not a little girl anymore, but there's a story called Child of Rage. And this little girl, I think her name is Beth, she had RAD pretty severely, and because she had come from a really awful environment. She was sexually abused early on, and she tried to cut off her little brother's genitals and all of this kind of stuff. And so reactive attachment disorder can be very bad. So that's kind of one piece of it. Now, Ed's mother was an alcoholic, she can't defend herself because she's dead, but, she was, from all reports, she was an alcoholic. So it's possible that she drank while she was pregnant. And like I said earlier, that, people didn't really understand that connection between what you're putting into your body and how it gets into the baby, right? So that low-level exposure to alcohol in a fetus, so like I said, it causes a deficit in development of white matter in those kind of executive functioning areas of the brain. Now, Ed also had early sexually violent fantasies, and he exhibited voyeuristic activities. So when his sister told him to kiss the teacher he had a crush on, he said to kiss her, I would have to kill her first. And then there's another story that Ed once took his stepfather's bayonet, which I think is a rifle with like a knife on the end of it. He took his stepfather's bayonet and snuck out in the middle of the night to peep on his second grade teacher. And he later described fantasies he had of killing her and then carrying off her dead body to make love to her. I can't even wrap my head around that. Well, what do all these early signs mean? Well, if you're a true crime enthusiast, the Macdonald Triad is a common part of your vernacular, but you may not know the background. The so-called Triad of Evil includes bedwetting past age 5, pyromania, and animal cruelty. In 1963, forensic psychiatrist J.M. Macdonald identified 3 characteristics that were exhibited by 48 of his most sadistic patients. And these traits, like I said, are bedwetting, pyromania, and animal cruelty. Well, this triad of evil has been largely debunked as the definitive predictor of, serial killer psychopathy. But let's talk about why so many serial killers have engaged in childhood pyromania and animal torture. Well, it's likely that fire starting and animal torture arise as symptoms of parental abuse or brutality. They're symptoms of something that's going on at home. And these acts give the child a sense of power and control in a world where they are powerless. I believe, from everything I've read and kind of studied, I believe that bedwetting, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that thinks this, I believe that bedwetting is a symptom of sexual abuse. When a child wets their bed past age 5, it's not because their bladder's too small. Often what can happen is a child separates themselves from their genitals in order to protect themselves. So they may not wake up at with the urge to go urinate. So around the same time as Macdonald's work on sadistic killers, cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead, so this is like 1964, she noted that one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a child is to kill or torture an animal and get away with it. Okay. So over the decades, the validity of this Macdonald Triad has been largely debunked as the definitive predictor of violence. More recent studies indicate that the path to serial killer psychopathy is much more complex and multifaceted. So it's likely that a combination of factors such as childhood physical or sexual abuse or both, isolation and or neglect, some kind of genetic predisposition towards addiction, a preference for autoeroticism in lieu of experimentation with peers, and or interest in or engagement in voyeurism. So together, these factors serve as really good predictors of violence or psychopathy. Now, there is a recurring theme among sexually motivated serial killers. Mommy issues. Having an emotionally absent mother, an abusive mother, or an excessively domineering mother has been a staple of serial killer analyses for decades. Ravitch and Schlesinger in 1981, it's a long time ago, found that in cases of sexually motivated compulsive gynocide, the murder of women, there was some unhealthy emotional involvement with the mother. They felt that this resulted in the displacement of affect from mother to other women, culminating in displaced matricide, right? So matricide is the killing of your mother. So there's a fusion of aggression and sex. Finally, the last thing is you mix in a little head trauma or an injury to this proverbial stew of those former predictions, and you've got the potential for a real problem. By age 10, Ed exhibited 6 of the 8 common characteristics of a serial killer. So let's go back and review these one more time. Childhood physical or sexual abuse, isolation and or neglect, genetic predisposition towards addiction, preference for autoeroticism in lieu of experimenting with peers, an interest in or engagement in voyeurism, along with animal cruelty. So he doesn't have any kind of pyromania stuff happening, but he'll get a head trauma later on. So he was living in Montana with his mother and 2 sisters, and life in Montana was not great. Ed had trouble making friends, and he continued to be the target of his mother's abuse. This is just the beginning of the Coed Killer story. So join me in the next episode as we talk about Ed Kemper, the teenager. You can follow the podcast on most of your social media platforms at skbpod, or you can visit the website at www.skbpod.com for more information about the show and a little bit of a blog that I do. If you're enjoying SKB, please take a moment to give it a 5-star review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spreaker, Podcast Republic, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. And once again, thank you for joining me on my journey to understand evil. Until next time.
All of this was new, concentrating hard. Like a little girl smoking for the first time. It wasn't a moment, it was a feeling of moving back. I've had nothing like it since, and oh, where did it go? And oh, where did it go? Spent a hot trigger, the atmosphere was filled, a lot of fluid and dirt seemed to be traveling face